Greetings and welcome to a new era of Conversations with Consequences. You may have heard us before locally on the Guadalupe Radio Network or on our podcast, which still continues, but we're thrilled now to be featured with the entire EWTN radio family across the nation and around the world. I'm your hostess, Dr. Grazie Christie.
And I'm Andrea Picciotti-Bayer. And we've got a great conversation coming up with our good friend and repeat offender, as we like to call people who have come on our show again and again. We have a recidivism.
Our very tolerant friends.
We have Kathryn Jean Lopez, and she's editor at large of the National Review. And Kathryn is one of the greatest voices in the pro-life movement, in the Catholic world, and she's also connected the dots in the importance of linking our pro-life advocacy and adoption and foster care, and has put on some wonderful forums and lunches with National Review Institute. And I think that was the first time where I had my aha moment and understood that if we really want to advocate and support life, we need to see at all stages, including for kids and families that are kind of working through the foster care system and facing adoption. So we're super happy that she's going to come in, and I know that this is also a topic that's close to your heart, Gracie.
It's very close to my heart, and I've been very fortunate that Kathryn's invited me to participate in some of her events and forums on adoption and foster care and connecting our pro-life movement and our pro-life sentiments and ideals to adoption and foster care. I'm an adoptive mom. My fifth child, we adopted from China. And she's a present from God like no other that we can imagine. And all adoptive parents I know feel like I do, as a gratuitous gift from God, these children that come into our lives and bless us every day with their presence. And it's true that as Kathryn believes that as Christians, as Catholics, we need to keep maintaining that connection and broadening that connection between a real concern for the dignity of human beings and adoption and foster care for the most vulnerable among us, which are children, of course, who find themselves alone in the world.
But before we have Kathryn come on, we had this brilliant out-of-the-box idea, which was to call in some friends that we've met along the way in learning about foster care and adoption, and an incredible, vivacious woman who I'm just amazed with in general. Her name is Kelly Rosati, and in addition to a good use of vowels, like any good Italian background could have, Kelly is one of the country's greatest foster care advocates. She's an adoptive mother of 4. She's worked extensively for foster youth nationwide, and she really has a unique and engaging understanding of the crisis that our country is facing and the supports that families and kids in foster care or that are looking for adoptive forever homes are needing. So we're super glad, Kelly, that you've agreed to drop everything and take a few minutes to talk to us a little bit about your experiences as a foster parent and kind of what are the challenges that you see that you guys have faced as a family and that you see other foster families and adoptive families facing and how we can help more.
Well, it's super great to be with you. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I love that you three and your, that includes Kathryn coming on later, and really taking your voices and your leadership to advocate just as Jesus would have us do for the least of these and really put that spotlight on kids in foster care. So some people think that kids are in foster care because they're naughty or bad or delinquent, and it's really important that people understand that kids go into foster care really through no fault of their own. It's because they have been abused or neglected or abandoned, and it is not safe for them to be with their birth families. And so you can just imagine what a horror that is for a kid. You know, for most of us, it's somewhat unimaginable to think about the very people that God designed to give you love and care and nurture to be the ones causing such harm in your life. And so these kids have really struggled, and then they continue to struggle. And, of course, the goal of foster care is that they can get back safely with their parents, with their birth parents, that if, for example, their birth parents are having an addiction issue that has led to the abuse and neglect, that they can get the services they need and that family can be preserved. And that is really the goal of foster care. But as we know, it just often isn't the case. And so for more than, always more than 100,000 kids in our country, they just languish. They just sit there in foster care, and they're kind of invisible to us. You don't see them in an orphanage when you drive down the road. They're just in our communities, and they're in the schools, and they're in our dentist's offices, hopefully, if they're getting good care. Mm-hmm. And they don't belong anywhere. And I just ask people oftentimes to just imagine what it would be like. Just try to imagine what it would be like to belong nowhere permanently and with no one.
It's really a heartbreaking concept,
yeah,
especially when we know children.
Loneliness of that, and that is what is being faced by children in our very own communities and in our country. And I guess one of the things Kathryn and I and all of us have talked about is just there's no reason for this. There are more than 300,000 churches in the United States, and this is a problem we could solve if honestly all of us could, collectively more effectively walk our talk as it relates to the dignity of every human person, the sanctity of life, the value of family, and really Jesus' admonition to us to be people who welcome and who love.
Kelly, you mentioned before some of the trauma that kids that are in foster care have gone through, and the supports that they need. What have been some of the greatest supports that you have received, if you're willing to kind of share a little bit about that? And what are the things that you still think need to be more available for foster children and the families that are helping foster them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the first thing I would say, and the most important answer to that question is the following. People need to be willing to accept the reality and the truth and the science that when a child is abused and neglected and deprived as a young person, it changes their brain. And they have been traumatized and harmed in a way that is often going to manifest in acting out. And so the example I like to give is you have two kids, one from a typically developing child from a healthy family, and one who's experienced abuse, neglect, and abandonment and now in foster care. And let's say they're both in junior high, and they are both stealing food. Let's just go with that as an example. One of the kids is having an issue that needs to be dealt with in a way that, parents typically think about these things. Mm-hmm. You have a kid who's, making bad choices and needs to be disciplined in a loving way, but understands they're really, acting out in a way that takes correction. Well, the other kid who's been in foster care is stealing food because lives in terror that he's never going to get enough food because he's been starved his whole life. You can't treat those situations the same. And so for many foster and adoptive parents who are trying to parent kids who have come from this trauma, the kids are acting out, and people who don't know and who don't care to get educated just often think, well, you just need to be stricter and you just need to get that kid in line. And that's the most harmful attitude and the most harmful thing, really, that can happen to foster adoptive parents and to that child, is to have people around and in their lives who are judgmental and who come without an attitude of compassion and clarity around what they've been through and what it takes to heal. God is so amazing in that when we are injured in relationship, as these kids have been, healing can also come through relationship, and that's what they need, and that's who they need us to be for them. And so for me, as a foster parent for a time and then an adoptive parent for 20 years of kids, 4 kids that were adopted from foster care, the most important thing I needed from people who loved us was compassion and a willingness to help us help our struggling kids and not judge and not ignore, but be there with us. And
well, I'm really glad, Kelly, that you found people like that in your life. I'm assuming that you did, and that I know that you're being that person for other foster parents and other foster families as they face the same struggles. And thank you so much for joining us. I know Andrea and I were so impressed when we heard you speak at the Charlotte Lozier Institute. We were there for a reunion, and you amazed us, and you continue to amaze us with your commitment to foster children.
Absolutely.
well, thanks for having me.
Thank you so
now-
much, Kelly.
And now we're going to turn to our main guest and very good friend. Welcome, Kathryn Jean Lopez, to Conversations with Consequences.
Thank you.
It's very nice of you to make time for us again. You are a repeat offender, as we said at the top of the hour.
Well, thank you so much, too, for having Kelly on, because as you say, she really is such a bright light and beacon in this world of foster care and adoption, and really being a conscience, I think, for Christians and for pro-lifers. And as Andrea was saying, it was really striking to me a number of years ago, for whatever reason, I guess it's God's plan. A number of young people started asking me questions about, what there are kids who need homes, right? Like, how do we get to them? Mm-hmm. And I realized, even writing about pro-life issues for 20 years, I didn't actually know the answer. And so,
well, and Kathryn, you make a big point. There aren't just a handful of kids right now in the country. There are over 400,000 kids in the foster care system.
Right.
And this isn't, and sadly, people sometimes leave the foster care system and they're able to reunite back into their homes. Sometimes they're adopted, but oftentimes they age out.
Right. I was at an event the Department of Health and Human Services did for Adoption Month in November. And it's kind of heartbreaking to me that we only pay attention to adoption sort of nationally once a year. Then there's Foster Care Month in May. But that having been said, that there was this wonderful event which focused primarily on the testimonies of young adults who were adopted when they were 17 or 18.
Wow.
And it really changes their life, because it's either you have no one in the world or you have someone, right? And who's made a commitment to you, and a sort of a gratuitous commitment. Like, they don't have a biological bond to you, but they don't want you to be alone. And
and it's interesting, the idea of, we have this kind of false age of 18. Like, you're on your own, or no, get out.
Right.
And just raising kids.
No one who knows an 18-year-old thinks an 18-year-old is an adult.
Well,
right?
and anyone that's parenting.
18-year-olds are sometimes less mature than 12-year-olds, in my opinion.
There you go.
And each child along the way needs that accompaniment, right? Walking with them through their own discovery of who they are and what God's plan for them are. And it seems like it is a very scary time, just as you're about to hit that age of adulthood, to look around you and not know if there's anybody that's
who's going to help
for you.
Right, exactly. And
You know,
think
Kathryn,
about it, just being adults, we need people in our lives, right? And so the idea that we would leave these poor children alone in the world is just, it should be unthinkable to us.
Kathryn, when we heard Kelly speak at the Charlotte Lozier Institute, she did not gloss over the difficulties of foster care, and that made a really big impression on me, because there's a big disconnect between, sort of having that dreamy thing, I'd love to foster a child sometime, and the reality of it. And then I think it's when you confront the reality and the great need that is inseparable from that reality of difficulty, then that's when you can really get into the space where you could actually consider foster care.
Right. It's important not to lie to people, right, about what they're getting into. But as Kelly was talking about, I mean, the possibilities for healing in the familial relationship are real. That doesn't mean it's easy. And if she talked longer, I mean, she has so many struggles her now teenage children, because they've experienced such trauma in their lives, which just stretches her heart all the more, her and her husband John, because they know this terrible pain that these children have gone through, and it's so unfair, and so it brings them to love them more. And one thing I in a Catholic context, Kelly and her family go to evangelical church, and I find that Catholics have a lot to learn from evangelicals in this area. And part of it is because we are so institutional as a church. A lot of us just assume somebody's taking care of that problem.
Yeah. Catholic Charities is going to
exactly. Now, meanwhile, Catholic Charities in many places is not doing adoption right now because of the conscience issues with laws, and so the question, we have to get better as parishes to look around and see what are the needs in our community. A lot of us have no idea what the needs in our community are. A lot of us have no idea what the needs down the pew from us are. It's really that's not the way that Christ means us to be a family. And so I think we have a lot to learn from that model, where you as a church together, a parish church, start looking around and realizing too, not everyone is called to foster or adopt. But do you know who the families in your parish are who are? Mm-hmm. And are you helping? Are you providing, date nights and food and, just little things that make a tremendous difference? And that's something that Kelly talks about sometimes too. She's got all the resources in the world in one sense when it comes to adoption, because she knows what the resources are and she knows what that world is. But she and her husband felt really alone when they were really struggling with the trauma these kids have experienced in their lives, because nobody else sort of understood in their church. And there's also this terrible thing that we do where when someone's doing something kind of extraordinary, we say, oh, wow, well, Kelly and John are saints. And so that sort of gets us off the hook.
Because we're not saints.
Exactly,
we're not saints,
right.
So
Kathryn doesn't have to do anything because she's not a saint, But we're all called to be saints. Yes, exactly. So, we can't do that.
Kathryn,
if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Kathryn Jean Lopez of the National Review about the fate of foster children and the role of faith-based adoption agencies in this great work. Talking about that, Kathryn, let's take a step back and talk about why there are so many children in foster care, in need of foster care in the United States. What do you think has tipped the balance?
Well, it's
in
the
last
opioid
decade or so.
It's the opioid crisis, in the last couple of years has really done such damage to the family, which I remember. I think it was last year, the State of the Union address. I was really grateful to the president because he highlighted this story, which was a mom who was just addicted and she couldn't raise her child, and a police officer and his wife had adopted the child, and it really was this story where you get the sense of the desperation in the addiction, and she just can't do it. Yeah. And so somebody has to step in for this poor child, And you want to be able to help rehabilitate where it's possible, but she was not in a place.
Well, and it's interesting. Foster care, in theory, is supposed to be a temporary place, right? When there's a crisis going on in a family system and a child, either because of abuse going on or substance abuse that the parents are struggling with, or just needing to kind of get their act together, the child needs to have a place of stability. Sometimes that is temporary while the parents are getting the supports that they need, and sometimes it becomes a longer period, and you hear of these very long-standing foster care and that lead to forever homes, oftentimes in the same foster home. But I want to bring back to something that you touched upon, Kathryn, and it reminds me of beautiful high school classmate of mine. She's a foster mom in Western Michigan, and she started a group called Hope Packages. And she works with all the neighboring companies and friends, and they put together backpacks for kids that have all the essentials for when you have to be taken from your home of origin and put into a foster care setting. And simple things, like a toothbrush and a pair of pajamas. And you hear oftentimes, because this is a moment of crisis that leads someone to need to be taken from their home and placed in foster care. And it's an easy thing. I get these pictures of they all get together on a Saturday and put together backpacks for kids of different ages.
Besides, that's lovely, but what about going back to causes, what about the breakdown of the family? I mean, if such a huge percentage, I don't have the percentage at my fingertips right now, but children are being born into families with unmarried parents, that's already a position of extreme insecurity, right, for these children. That then anything can push them into the next terrible insecurity, which is needing foster care. What do you think, Kathryn, about that?
Yeah, I think this is why it's so important for us to be talking about this, to be shedding light not just on the families like Kelly Rosati and Lisa Wheeler, who you'll have on later, who have been stepping up to the plate, and they can talk about the transformation that sometimes happens with the children, and while also speaking to the harsh realities of the trauma that they've experienced. But I also think it's so important, and Gracie, you talk beautifully about this, to celebrate birth mothers, so that women appreciate. So we have some kind of cultural context for a woman who is pregnant and doesn't feel like she can do this, and maybe she can't do it. Mm-hmm. And it's not a shameful thing to say, mm-hmm. I'm not in the best position right now to raise this child, but I know there are families who will welcome this child into their lives, and we need to make that a more mainstream acceptable thing, because there is still this
there's a lot of stigma.
Exactly. There's a shame that women feel.
Adoption.
And even that language, right? Giving up the child for adoption.
I know, it's terrible.
And it's right in some sense, because it is the sacrifice, but I think we have to honor the sacrifice that this woman is making and talk about her as the hero that she is. Mm-hmm. She's allowing this child to be born, and yes, making the sacrifice of giving this gift to another family. But
that's how we talk to our adopted daughter about her birth parents, both the father and the mother. And even her extended family. We always tell her that they were likely heroes, that we have to think of them as heroes, who gave that little girl a chance at a life where she would be really cherished and cared for in a way that they couldn't do. They simply couldn't do it. Right. It's not that they didn't want to. They simply weren't able to.
Kathryn, I think it was one of the National Review Institute lunches that you hosted where I was introduced to a fine young man who was adopted. And as an adult, he was searching, as many people do, for his birth mother. And he started something that I think is just lovely and beautiful, and it's a chance for people to celebrate the birth moms. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that initiative. And he's a knight. He's a knight of Columbus.
Yeah, you're talking about Dennis Gerber. Yeah, he a couple of years ago applied to get his birth certificate to find out who his mother was, and he wound up connecting with her over Facebook, mm-hmm. and then eventually going out to Phoenix, I believe is where she lives, and meeting her and the family around her, and he talks about adoption as multiplying graces, because
beautiful.
He has his life and his beautiful family. He gets to meet her family, and a life that wouldn't have happened, if she had raised him. And so there's just so much gratitude he has, and that she has, and he connected with a group before he connected with his birth mother. He connected with this group based out of Dallas called Brave Love, and they celebrate birth mothers, and they have these parties that are basically thank you. And so he threw one of these in New Jersey, where he's from, and it was basically look, I can't say thank you to my birth mother, so I'm saying thank you to you because you all gave your children life, and it's the greatest gift you can give, and you're all heroes. And we need more of that. We need more of that in the mainstream, and we need to know these people and their stories. And what's so heartbreaking to me, in the fall, I hosted at the Sheen Center in New York with the Human Life Review and the National Review Institute a screening of the movie I Lived on Parker Avenue, which is the story of a young man who goes to meet his birth mother to say thank you. And one of the most heartbreaking things when you watch the movie, and it's available online, it's only a half hour, or you can watch it when you have some time, and I encourage you to, if you haven't seen it. When the heartbreaking moments are when you realize for 20 some years this woman has been in anguish that he hates her because she gave him up, as we say. But the opposite was the case. He was just so tremendously grateful that he was alive and he had his family, who he considers his family, and so these women shouldn't have to be in this kind of agony. We should be talking about this differently.
Well, and I imagine,
and of course,
each story is probably complicated and difficult, and there may be people who feel abandoned, but the answer to all of that is to have a community that wraps our arms around birth mothers and children.
In a country like ours, where sadly tens of thousands of abortions are deemed the solution every year for pregnancies that are inconvenient or unwanted or a crisis or however we want to talk about them, to really hold up and really acknowledge the dignity of a woman and a man too, right? Sometimes the couple's involved in this decision of giving a child a chance at life with a family that can receive the child properly. You've been listening to Conversations with Consequences. I'm Dr. Grazie Christie, along with my co-host, the legal eagle of the Catholic Association, Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, and our dear friend, Kathryn Jean Lopez. We're going to close the doors and not let her leave so we can continue our conversation with her after the break, coming up next on EWTN Radio. Welcome back to Conversations with Consequences. I'm your hostess, Dr. Grazie Christie.
And I'm Andrea Picciotti-Bayer. And we've been having a great conversation about the wonderful world of foster care and adoption. And I wanted just to ask Grazie to share a little bit about a wonderful presentation that she put together. I think it was for the National Review, right? For you, Kathryn, on how we need to think about adoption when we're considering adoption, and especially where our focus should be on. Grazie? Well,
Kathryn asked me, maybe it was 2 or 3 years ago, to give a little talk it was at the CIC, wasn't it, Kathryn?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, she put together a great forum on adoption and foster care, as she has done many times in different venues. And I wrote about the fact, and then I spoke about the fact, that when we were adopting our little girl, it became clear to me, because I was on all these adoption forums on the internet and talking to different people and listening to other people's ideas about adoption. It became very clear to me that there's two ways to look at adoption and taking care of vulnerable children. Is the focus on the adoptive parents who are in need of a child for whatever reason, usually because of infertility. Natural infertility, the kind that's physiologic, or is the issue the child and the needs of the child? And it seems to me, from a Christian perspective, that we have this, we have a very important focus on the child, on the needs of the vulnerable person in this relationship, and this budding relationship. That it's good to communicate to the world. Adoption is not the way where adults fulfill their desires. Adoption is the way that families are provided to children who desperately need them. And when you put the focus like that on the child, then I think it also opens space for a real valuing of foster care too. it's not just adoption, which gives a child a permanent family, but also foster care, which is able to also fulfill that need for children, sometimes on a temporary basis, but always the focus like a laser on the needs of the child, not on the desires of adults for fulfillment or completion.
Well, it seems that this dovetails perfectly into what's behind our advocacy for pro-life, right? When we think about the pro-life movement, it's really focusing on the needs of the unborn child and bringing their life to us. Is that one of the kind of reminding themes that you're bringing up, Kathryn, when you're bringing people to talk and to focus on foster care and adoption in the greater pro-life conversation?
Sometimes people who don't agree with us on abortion say that we don't care about the baby after it's born. One thing that I have realized is there's some truth to that. Obviously, that's a very broad statement, but I do think that when we hear it, rather than get defensive, we should treat it as an examination of conscience. First of all, why do they think that about us? And is there something more we can be doing?
How do I prove them wrong?
Yes, exactly. Inundate them with our love for children, right? And children in difficult situations, and acknowledging too that it doesn't end with the birth. Mm-hmm. You know, our commitment to mothers and families. And I love to go pray in. There's a convent that the Sisters of Life in New York have that happens to be just across town from my office, and it's the home that they have for pregnant women and for their children, and they stay with them for I think up to a year and a half sometimes, and make sure they really get on their feet and they really can do this. And I mean, the sisters are really part of their lives, and it's so beautiful sometimes too to see years later, you know, the teenager who loves this one particular sister because she was the one who, you know, stayed up with him some night. Exactly. There's a real love there, but the sisters aren't just about making sure the child doesn't die at the abortion clinic, right? That's part of the story. The continual part of the story is you walk with this family that needs love and needs support. I think that every year when the March for Life happens, every time we hear, you know, we're in a presidential election year, every time abortion comes up, instead of being more adamant, right, can we ask questions like, what more can we do? And I think this adoption foster care piece of it is a huge piece of it that we're not necessarily going there all the time, and we need to. The pro-life movement is about more than defunding Planned Parenthood.
You introduced me once to a incredible fellow who is leading a group of evangelical churches, and they have an organization called, is it More Than Enough?
The Christian Alliance for Orphans, and they have an initiative. Jed Medfin is who you're talking about. They have an initiative called More Than Enough, and it's based on that principle that Kelly brought up, that we have enough Christian churches in America that we can do this. And actually, one of a couple of the things that have been so encouraging to me since we started convening conversations and things about adoption and foster care is, first of all, I had an event after the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast 2 years ago, and Walter Olson from the Cato Institute was in the front row, and so he's a man who's married to a man who has an adopted child, and he said to me, we need the churches in this picture. And it was really such an important moment for me to realize we can really work together. Like we can agree to disagree on some fundamentals, right? But also appreciate there are children in need, and we need more people, not less people, involved in this. So if and the other thing in New York, I've been able to have a number of conversations, and here in DC too, actually, with Jewish women talking about adoption, and you want the birth mother to be able to go to a Jewish adoption agency if that's what she wants. we need to have more freedom rather than less in this, and that people can work together even though we have different points of view is really crucial right now, especially at this moment where there's this cancel culture and all of this this sense that you have to have the approved party line or you're not acceptable company. We need a little less of that. And
Kathryn,
you bring up a good point, Kathryn, that you bring up the need for different kinds of adoption agencies and foster care agencies to take care of different kinds of children and parents, right? That need help to come together. And there has been a very strong movement against faith-based agencies because many faith-based agencies, Catholic ones especially, but also Christian ones, they can't in good conscience place a child with a same-sex couple because it goes against, of course, their religious understanding of what is best for children, which is a married mother and father, and what marriage is, especially.
Well, and you mentioned, we mentioned before earlier in the conversation the legal cases, and just to kind of help our listeners know what's going on in the courts, this is an issue that's super active, and it's active on two fronts. One is that local and state governments are demanding compliance with anti-discrimination laws, and they're presenting it in a way that requires agencies, foster care or adoption agencies, partnering with these governments to agree to certify same-sex couples. And for Catholic agencies, certifying a same-sex couple as an appropriate family system is contrary to Catholic teaching on family and marriage. And so a number of agencies in D.C., Boston, the state of Illinois have closed down because they couldn't agree to this anti-discrimination provisions. And a few have stood up for the rights not only of the faith-based groups to function consistent with the teachings of their faith or teachings of Catholicism, but also standing up for the kids. And one of those cases we've here at the Catholic Association we've been involved in, and it involves Philadelphia's Catholic Social Services. And I know, Kathryn, you've been watching this case along with me as well.
Well, you literally were in the courtroom, weren't you?
I was in the courtroom. Yeah. I was at the Court of Appeals, at the appellate argument, and
Where was that?
It was in Philadelphia, which gave me an opportunity to go and have one of the biggest sandwiches I've ever
Your real
always
motivation
eaten. It was so delicious. I really wanted to live in Philadelphia after that. But it was what was difficult about this is it doesn't need to be an either or, in my perspective, and I think in the perspective of the lawyers representing Catholic Social Services in Philadelphia and the people that are working there on the front lines. Their whole approach has been, we can't certify these couples who have never come looking for our support.
Well, that's the infuriating thing about
they've
Philadelphia.
Never come.
There is no complaints.
There's been no couple has been turned away, but if a couple ever came to us, we wouldn't turn them away. We would refer them to one of the other 28 agencies in the city working with the city who can serve them. And
so where does the animus come from? If no one's being turned away, where is this feeling coming from that these people want to close down the faith-based agencies?
It's an intolerance to traditional points of view, which is amazing because it wasn't very long ago where Barack Obama held these views. This has been a really rapid shift, and there really is this sort of tyrannical impulse where everyone must comply. And no, why can't we just refer? This is like the Little Sisters of the Poor case. Why on earth do they even have to have a conversation about contraception? This is stupid. And it makes me angry, too, because sometimes when I'm down in D.C., I stay with the Little Sisters, and I see the beautiful work that they do, and they don't need to be distracted by this ridiculous fight that is unnecessary. But thanks be to God, they're rising to the occasion and defending our religious freedom.
You're listening to Conversations with Consequences. I'm Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, and I'm here with my dear friend, Dr. Grazie Christie, and we're joined by our other dear friend, Kathryn Jean Lopez of the National Review, and we're talking about foster care, adoption, conscience rights, religious liberties, and basically allowing our whole goal in all of this is to put a spotlight on the crisis that our country and children are facing, and encourage everyone to kind of be all hands on deck. This is not one group or one institution can take care of the problem. All of us have to start paying attention and figuring out what little we can do or what great things we can do to lend a hand.
But everyone has a role.
When we talk about the way that the faith-based agencies are being beaten out of the public square, as they have been many places, and people are still trying to do that, and it reminds me so much when I was in China adopting our daughter. I spent many days there, about 3 weeks, and I would carry around with me, obviously an Occidental person, a Western person, we say, and I was carrying around this lovely Chinese baby with big fat cheeks and her pretty eyes, and people would come up to me, Chinese people, and they would point at me and they would say, "Christian, Christian, Christian," because in their understanding, which was very clear to them, they understood that there was an ethos behind adoption, and that ethos was Christian. The idea that every person is our brother or sister, and the more vulnerable and needy that they are, the more attention has to be paid to them, and the more welcome they have to be into our families. And so it seems insane to me that with that knowledge, that I think people understand that. They're trying to forget it, but they understand that it's our Christian, our Judeo-Christian understanding of the human person that drives adoption and foster care in many instances.
Well, and Gracie, just thinking about the role of the church, the Catholic Church in particular, that from the very beginnings, right, we talk about St. Joseph being the foster father of the baby true. Jesus, right? Beautiful. And all along the way, these wonderful examples of the church as institution and individual Catholics responding to the needs of the orphaned or the vulnerable child in need. And here in our country, we have a great tradition where even before governments got involved in foster care and adoption, the Catholic Church was there. And Catholics, individual Catholics, were responding to the needs of kids that were without parents.
Adoption is at the core of our identity as Christians. We're adopted by our Heavenly Father. There is no way around it, you know. Amen. And we try to get a way around it, but I do think that it's so important for everyone to pray about what their role in this is, and it may be opening your home, it may be helping someone else who has opened their home, but everyone in a Catholic parish has a role in this. And
sometimes
now we're not rising to that.
Sometimes it's just in our language, don't you think, Kathryn,
yes,
in the way that we speak about
yes.
adoption and foster care?
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes it's what you share on social media. Stop watching the reality TV show that is impeachment or Donald Trump, and realize that you actually can have an impact on the world.
Well, you made mention to Dennis Gerber and what he observed personally, and that the overflowing of blessings and graces that come through this entire kind of gift of self through the adoption and foster care program. I guess we're a church of grace, and we can really respond to this need, and we'll all benefit, and we'll be benefiting the most vulnerable around us.
The fact of the matter is, the more we love, the more love we experience, and the more we actually are living our Christian lives, and this just is a key component to it.
I'm glad you brought up the idea, the knowledge that we have, that when God's relationship to us is through adoption, and it's the one He chose to have with us. He could have related to us in any other way, but He chose adoption, and it bridges that. Somehow, adoption bridges that space between the divine and the human, and in our families, adoption bridges the space between biology and the heart. That's the way adoptive parents experience it, I know.
And I think the example of your family, Gracie, I mean, when families do adopt and do have that active hospitality and welcome that Kelly was talking about at the beginning of the show, it makes all of us better. It makes us all start to think more about the Christian family and creation differently.
Any new child into a home makes the family in the home that much more filled with light. Mm-hmm. And whether the child comes in biologically or comes in through foster care or adoption, I'm sure our whole goal in all of this is to have bright and cheerful homes, and that we can make of our domestic church kind of a beacon for others that are struggling or walking in darkness to go towards.
Kathryn, do you feel you've made progress in your effort to shine a spotlight on foster care and adoption?
Miles to go. I am encouraged. More people are paying attention, and every time there's an event, I get somebody pulling me aside about the text he and his wife were, sharing back and forth. Beautiful. and people going through the process and so but we have big goals, right? We want to make a culture change, and there's still a lot to do.
Well, I think you're well on your way, Kathryn, and all of us thank you very much for putting the spotlight where it belongs.
Gosh, thanks for using this show today to talk about this.
This is a treat for us.
Well, thanks for joining us, Kathryn. And I'm sure you'll come and be a repeat offender again if we ask you, right?
Of course.
Recidivism at its best here on Conversations with Consequences. Gracie, this was a fantastic show. I think we're getting better and better. Or I'm praying that we're getting better and better. But I think that in general, in addition to you, our guests are carrying this. And I hope that our listeners are enjoying having wonderful people like Kelly Rosati and Kathryn Lopez come on and basically shake us out of our sleep, wake us up, tell us this is something that we need to both be educated about, be involved in, bring to our prayer, and respond.
I like the way that Kathryn tells us, and it's so true, that we say, oh, well, maybe not everyone can adopt or is called to adopt or to foster care, but she reminds us there's lots of ways to get involved.
Yeah.
And you can be a help to someone else. The way you speak about it can be very positive. I know one thing I hate that people say all the time is when somebody talks about adoption and they'll say, why can't you have any of your own? And, sometimes that's enough to turn someone off, right? When you think of adopted children not being your own, well, of course they're your own. They're as your own as anything, as the ones you had biologically.
Well, and it's an interesting misconception, one that I had when I was interviewing foster moms, and I realized they speak about their foster kids the same way that I speak about my biological kids, and what they're doing is they're mothering. Mm-hmm. And it's a good way to remember when you put the focus on the needs of that child. It's the same exciting challenge and adventure that all parents face.
Every morning, the Catholic Association reviews all the latest news and sends our subscribers a carefully curated collection of the most important news of the day. Items are specifically selected for a smart Catholic audience like you. Don't let the world take you by surprise. Subscribe to our daily media roundup at thecatholicassociation.org. And now, as is customary, Father Roger Landry offers us a short and inspiring homily to prepare us for this Sunday's Gospel.
This is Father Roger Landry, and it's a joy to have a chance to ponder with you the consequential conversation God wants to have with us tomorrow on the second Sunday of Lent. Every year, 10 days into Lent, the Church has this journey with Jesus to the top of an exceedingly high mountain. It does so for the same reason why God the Father conceded to Peter, James, and John the experience of accompanying Jesus to the Transfiguration in the first place. To give them a foretaste of Jesus Christ's glory, to sustain them when they will see Jesus transfigured in blood, pain, and suffering on Good Friday. There's an intrinsic connection between Mount Tabor and Mount Calvary, between the glory of the Transfiguration and the glorification of Christ and the throne of the cross. And that's why we ponder it at the beginning of Lent each year. We see in the Transfiguration what the subject matter of the conversation between Jesus and the two great heroes of the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah, were. Moses and Elijah were both precursors of Lent. Elijah had lived a Lent of 40 days, crossing the desert to the mountain of God, Horeb, being hunted by King Ahab. Moses had spent 40 days in prayer at the top of Mount Sinai, and then 40 years with the Jews in the desert. Moses and Elijah came specifically to speak with Jesus, not about the glory that was to come, not about heaven, but about the culmination of the Lenten season, Jesus' suffering, cross, and death. St. Luke tells us they spoke about the exodus that Jesus was to accomplish in Jerusalem. This exodus meant the passage Jesus would make from slavery of death to the promised land of eternal life. Jesus, however, was speaking about this exodus while he was gloriously transfigured, not cowering in fear. God the Father wanted Peter, James, and John, and you and me, to see this scene so that it would sustain our faith when the suffering comes. The second connection between Tabor and Calvary is what God the Father says to the three apostles. God the Father speaks only 3 times in the whole New Testament. First time is at Jesus' baptism, when he says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." The last time is during the Last Supper, when he stated that he had glorified his Son and would glorify him again. This time at the top of the Mount of Transfiguration, however, when God the Father spoke from the cloud, he went further. After reiterating that Jesus is beloved Son, he tells the 3 apostles, listen to him. At first, this makes little sense. What had the apostles been doing for the past 2 years but listening to Jesus? God the Father, however, knew that they had only been selectively listening, and they had been tone deaf to what Jesus had been saying to them about his upcoming crucifixion and death. They didn't want to hear it. Jesus would tell them on 3 separate occasions that he would suffer, die, and on the 3rd day be raised. But they refused to take him seriously. They rebuked him, or they immediately began to fight for who would sit on his right and his left as he entered into what they thought was an earthly kingdom. Even after his foretold crucifixion occurred, which should have been a confirmation of his words, they really still didn't grasp what Jesus had said about being raised on the 3rd day, and were stunned when he walked through the closed doors of the upper room. They needed to see the connection between Jesus' glory and suffering. They needed to have faith that Jesus' exodus, as painful as it would be, would lead them all to the promised land. They needed truly to listen to Jesus. So do we. If we're making the connection between the 2 mountains, if we're seeking to listen to Jesus and enter into his exodus, then we need to follow Jesus as he ascends and as he comes down from the experience of prayer in Mount Tabor. Peter, we remember, wanted to build 3 booths to keep the experience going, to make it quasi-permanent, to stay put. This wasn't God's will for him, and it's not for us either. God wants us to journey, to leave the mountaintop with Christ, to go back into the world, and then climb Calvary with him. Are we ready this Lent to make the exertion to climb the mountain in prayer and fasting? Are we willing to come down with Jesus and bring the fruits of our prayer, to bring the love that our contact with God inspires, to share the word that we've listened to Jesus say as corporal and spiritual almsgiving to people in need? Are we ready, in short, to join Jesus' exodus and help others to do so? So we go with Jesus to Calvary, and through Calvary, go with him to the eternal Jerusalem. That's the type of consequential conversation Jesus wants to have with us on the second Sunday of Lent. And God the Father tells us, listen to him.
And we hope you'll catch us next week when we talk to Dr. Greg Popchak, an EWTN radio legend, with his show, More to Life. We'll be discussing the heavy topic of mental illness, and given his work as a counselor, he has much to share on this serious issue plaguing so many Americans. Catch us every Saturday at 5 p.m. on your EWTN local affiliate or on Sirius Channel 130, or check us out at thecatholicassociation.org/podcast.